So again, a very warm welcome to everyone to this afternoon session of Convergence. We are going to face the second panel, the second challenge of this two-day exhibition, this two-day event. And so if the first challenge was war and peace and reconciliation, we are now facing the question of anthropology, which means question on human being today. So our conversation wants to start with the quote from Psalm 8. We have also put this quote on the website for Convergence. And the Psalm 8 says, "When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars you set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and a son of man that you care for him?" So it seems that the psalmist says to himself, if you consider the immense measure of the universe, the human being seems to be such a small and irrelevant thing, but at the same time, it seems to be of infinite value and dignity. And this is where the paradox lies about the human being. And we think that this paradox is still today very important, something very important to look at. And today in contemporary, if we want to look at contemporary cultural situation about the knowledge of the human being, we can say that the knowledge of what a human being is can be approached by multiple point of view, sociology, psychology, neurophysiology. But given this huge amount of knowledge that we have today, with different approaches, it's difficult to have a unified image of the human being, and especially an image that can give us again this sense of wonder and marvelous, the marvelous feeling of the psalmist when he looks at the human being and says, and looks at his infinite value and dignity. But so today, to quote T.S. Eliot from The Rock, today we are running the risk to losing wisdom, to substituting wisdom with information, with just information. So we want to address from a different perspective this challenge with our speaker today that we welcome, Dr. Daniel Dehaan. Dr. Daniel Dehaan is the Frederick Copleston Senior Research Fellow and lecturer in philosophy and theology in the Catholic tradition at Campion Hall College here and Blackfriars here at the University of Oxford. And before coming to Oxford, Daniel was a postdoctoral fellow on the neuroscience strand of the Theology, Philosophy of Religion and Sciences project in the Faculty of Divinity and Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory in Cambridge. Before going to Cambridge in 2015, Dr. Dehaan received his doctorate in philosophy from the Center for Thomistic Study in Texas, Houston, and from the Wolf Mansion Center for Ancient, Medieval, and Renaissance Philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, here in Europe. So, before we start, I want to say, I was about to forget, this meeting is going to be recorded by Radio Maria, and is going to also, so it's broadcasted live now, but it's going to be also on the website. And if you want information about this and about Radio Maria in general, you can go ask at the end of the meeting to Tim Atkinson, who will be right here outside the auditorium for information about it. But so let's start the conversation. So the first question that I wanted to ask is related to what I was just saying about the difficulty of having a unified image of the human being, given these different approaches, different disciplines. So philosophy is a very old discipline, as we know, and has been considered like probably in many periods of the history, like the queen of the science in a sense. But today is a bit difficult to see this. Like not a lot of people read about philosophy. It seems not all of people care about philosophy. But do you think that philosophy can still have a role on this question of the human being? So can still have a role, a sort of like light, a guide through these different approaches, this sort of jungle of knowledge that we have today?
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So it's a difficult question. There are, of course, lots of rival philosophies. So it's going to depend on how you're thinking about what philosophy is and what its tasks are. And out of the tradition that we'll be talking a little bit more, it thinks of philosophy as the love of wisdom, where wisdom is understood as understanding the beginning and end of things and how everything interconnects. And so that's probably a view that a lot of philosophers could sign up to some version of that. But there are a lot of philosophies that today are very, very technical, and they're very academic and just like purely theoretical. And then there are others that are attempting to be more of a kind of public approach to philosophy. And then some who might, which would be the tradition I'm coming out of, is thinking of philosophy as trying to combine that in some sense that everyone's asking philosophical questions at certain points in times. Whenever you're trying to dig down and figure out like the fundamental gist of something, when you're asking complicated questions that you might be disagreeing with in terms of siblings or families, um, political problems, ethical problems, just everyday difficulties. When you dig down and ask deeper questions about what are the assumptions, you're asking philosophical questions. And often these do require getting into much more systematic, theoretical kinds of debates. And so once you follow the thread long enough, it does lead to these more academic, theoretical lines of inquiry. And that's going to be the case for any kind of inquiry. So you mentioned all these different kinds of disciplines, whether they be in psychology or in philosophy, or sorry, in neuroscience, whether they be behavioral economics, whether they be these different disparate disciplines. And in any one of those disciplines, we could always ask the question of like, what are they doing and what are they fundamentally asking? And how is this systematically or unsystematically related to a range of other inquiries? And that's going to fall outside the purview of those particular disciplines. Neurosciences only go so far as it investigates features having to do with neurons, neural assemblies, systems neuroscience, and the ways in which systems neuroscience starts to catch up with features of human behavior and psychology and animal behavior. But there's going to be these fissures, there's going to be these gaps between these disciplines, and there's going to be questions about what is the fundamental nature of that discipline and how does it connect up to these others. And if you want a survey of how politics, political theory, economics, political economy, ethics, how these bear upon all these issues in psychology, in neuroscience, and how these are somehow having a bearing on biology or evolutionary biology, how these are then connected to some conceptions of chemistry and physics and the fundamental particles that make up everything and where they ultimately came for in terms of cosmology, you're going to find yourself asking philosophical questions. And you're going to realize that you're already assuming a lot of philosophical concepts like what is the physical? What is the chemical? What is a human being? And while these disciplines can enrich and provide new questions for ways, new questions and ways of answering some of those questions, you're still at the bottom always going to be reaching out towards philosophical questions. Whenever you run a scientific experiment in biology, but especially in psychology and neuroscience, you always have to operationalize some concept. So if you want to do an experiment on memory, you really have to have some concept of memory. It's not like neuroscience discovered memory. Memory's been around as long as humans have been recording histories, telling anecdotes, remember what they did before. But neuroscience can tell you a lot of new things about memory that we might not have known before. So neuroscience doesn't discover a lot of these basic psychological concepts. They're already available, and the novelists sometimes are the best experts, better than even the philosophers, at telling us a lot about certain psychological concepts. But then philosophers can do a lot of sophisticated work in trying to clarify very carefully what are these concepts, and evaluating the methodology, maybe in some of the sciences that are attempting to critique them. I said at the beginning, it depends a lot on the kind of philosophical perspective you have. And so some philosophical approaches are ones that are quite radical revisionist. And I don't think that they would be helpful in these ways. So they want to develop very skeptical kinds of approaches to thinking about human beings and how a lot of the discoveries in the science and elsewhere have radically underturned.
Can you try to explain what do you mean by skeptical in this case? Like,
so they might think that discoveries in decision making and certain biases that we have shows that humans are actually acting irrational in ways that they don't otherwise think that they are. Or there might be tests, there are a number of experiments on antecedent awareness before voluntary actions, so like the neuroscience of free will. Or research on genetics and making arguments that human beings are genetically predisposed or even determined to do everything they do. And so a kind of philosophical view, whether it comes from a scientist or a philosopher themselves, that's going to be kind of radically revisionary with respect to common sense and saying the kind of agency that people think they have, the kind of reasoning that they think they deploy, the ways that they think about their lives are actually in some ways not up to them. and that their own agency and their own role in setting the directionality of their lives and the lives of others is actually shown to be undermined by these scientific experiments.
So we can say that from this approach is it's sort of like switch the order of things, like in the sense of, well, let's not look at what our experiences and suggest, but let's start from what this kind of science says, and then we kind of change our vision of the world based on just the information that we have from sciences, and we try to like fit what we know only into the description of science, which seems a bit ideological as a.
Yeah, so to use Wilfred Sellers made this distinction between the manifest image of humans in the world, or the scientific or the common sense image of humans in the world, and it's actually not one thing. It's important to recognize there's lots of rival historical situated views of common sense. So what we think is common sense in the 21st century is going to be quite different in different places in the world today, as well as elsewhere. But running roughshod over the importance of making that nuance, we can say there's a sort of common sense view about the humans as opposed to a scientific image of humans, or a scientific image of what humans are in the world. And again, this is just sort of misleading to say that these two cookie cutter shapes. There's the scientific image, and all scientists agree about that, and then there's the common sense image, and everyone agrees about that. There are lots of conflicting alternative views about what is common sense, and there are a lot of conflicting alternative views about the scientific image. But what often happens in these more skeptical modes is they say the scientific image of humans is something that there's basically complete consensus on, and it's radically skeptical or radically revisionary with respect to the common sense image. And so the kind of philosophical work that I and colleagues work on is one that's saying there's ways in which the scientific image will modify, will suggest revisions to our common sense image. Already the 21st century image that we have of ourselves as evolved beings is already a way in which the scientific image has transformed our common sense image of human beings. But it's not one that's radically revisionary. And in fact, there's important ways in which the scientific image really depends upon the common sense image. It's really an enrichment of the common sense image.
Right. So I like this idea of enrichment because it seems to take into account both realities, right? So there is the reality of science that is telling us a lot of new things, but also there is the reality of common sense, of experience. So there is no need to like rely on a conflict there. It depends more on a philosophical presupposition. Say, for example, neuroscience seems to suggest that we aren't free because of this experiment, whatever, and so our common experience of being free is certainly not true. Whereas in this different approach, it seems you want both, right? You want both, like the reality of the importance of the common sense experience. For example, let's take freedom example. Or I experience myself as free, but at the same time, I take seriously what science is. The science of the brain, I don't know, says about this. But is it your perspective? Right?
Yeah, so I think that we're actually not talking about two different scientific views. We're actually talking about two different philosophical assumptions or standpoints of how to think about the relationship of the scientific image of humans to the manifest or the common sense image of the humans. In those particular cases with the neuroscience experiments, these are the Benjamin Libet experiments of the 1980s, which have been replicated and variations have been done over the last 4 decades. All of them start with a particular concept of what is a voluntary action. And there are actually conflicting views about that. And so without going into the details, maybe in the Q&A people want to hear more about this, but those particular experiments have a very specific philosophical assumption about what is a free human action. And if you were to do the experiment, you would realize that they're going to make you do an activity you've never done ever in your life and take that as a paradigmatic kind of case of a voluntary action. And part of it is actually a deeper disagreement about the philosophy of human action and what is an account. So that'd be one thing. Another thing we can say, and this is a kind of pocket-sized argument against these sorts of radical revisionist views, is that from common sense, we know that human beings are rational. They deploy reasons in the ways in which they act. They're embodied. They can move glasses of water around. They can walk around. They can pick objects up. And they also have, using their reasons and in their embodiment, they have relative control. So human beings are the kind of beings that are embodied agents with rational control, right? Why did you hit me? I might say to my daughter, and she'll say, because you didn't give me some candy thing that I wanted. right? So that they have reasons for why they do certain activities that they have rational embodied control over. Well, that's not something we discover from science. That's something that's just a part of common sense. That's a part of the manifest image of human beings. And so we might have scientific experiments that show us limitations to this, that we don't exercise as much rational embodied control as we think we do. But some of the more radical interpretations of some of these experiments are to suggest that humans don't ever exercise the rational embodied control they think they have. Now, that's a kind of global skepticism about rational embodied control. The problem is it's self-defeating. Because what is a scientific experiment? It's a specific kind of enrichment of our already given ability for rational embodied control. It's an enrichment of a tradition of hundreds of years of developments of the scientific method, of how to actually conduct a controlled scientific experiment. But you can't run a controlled scientific neuroscience experiment without exercising as a scientist rational embodied control.
Right.
And for Brexit, we were contributing to the 10 billion pounds, euros that it costs to build the Large Hadron Particle Collider, where we're exercising incredible rational embodied control over small particles beaming nearly at the speed of light and colliding into each other. We can't even discover the things that are meant to be the overturning factors in the scientific image of the world without still exhibiting these everyday common sense powers of rational embodied control. So you could never have a neuroscience or any experiment for that matter which would show humans don't have rational embodied control. Because if humans didn't have rational embodied control, they couldn't perform scientific experiments. So that's always a kind of constraint on how radical the conclusions could be from any sort of scientific investigations of the world and humans.
Right. Interesting. I found honestly really fascinating this idea of the consequences of certain, like when one sort of embrace, let's say, like this kind of ideological scientific view ends up being like sort of self-defeating because he ends up denying what is doing.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. About all this, okay, we have talked already about a bit about this question of the neuroscience, because neuroscience has been like honestly a big thing in the last 30-40 years, also like in the public square. For example, there is this famous essay by Tom Wolfe, who was a American journalist in 1996 called "Sorry, Your Soul Just Died." Was like basically a kind of like journalistic way to explain the fact that it seems that discoveries in neuroscience have put in questions like these traditional ideas that we had about human being. We just talked right now about freedom, but also like they talk about consciousness, so self knowledge of ourself, all these kind of realities that are so evident to us because are like part of us, part of our conscious personal first person perspective experience have been put in question. So there is a lot of these also in the more like outside the academic work. This kind of like reality has arrived. But as a person that has been in a laboratory of neuroscience for 2 years, right, like you in Cambridge, from like a philosophical, but more generally from your experience, what do you think is the value today of the neuroscientific work, and what is its role? And if you think like, for example, did the neuroscientific inquiry help you to work through philosophy in your philosophical work, in your philosophical questions?
Yeah. So, I mean, undisputably, I think neuroscience is going to be and has been tremendously beneficial for thinking through diagnoses and thinking through treatments and the range of pharmacological interventions that will be available and other kinds of surgical and medical interventions that have been and will continue to be available, I think is undeniable. I also think that, humans wonder. They wonder about the heavens, they wonder about the earth, and they wonder about themselves. And any genuine inquiry into some object of value is worthwhile. And so studying human and other nervous systems is a worthwhile pursuit, just even if it wasn't about us. If it was just for the sake of understanding these things, that would be completely fruitful and worthwhile. I think it's interesting about a lot of the predictions that the Wolfe essay makes, how none of them have come to being. In fact, like the sort of wild predictions that he was making.
It was from the 1996,
Yeah.
so it was like, yeah.
And recently there was this famous bet with Chalmers and Christoph Koch about whether or not the science of consciousness in the last 2 decades would actually be able to discover, and solve some of the hard problems of consciousness.
That's the context. That Chalmers is like a Anglo-American, is it Australian? Australian philosopher who is probably the most famous guy on this question of consciousness. So, what is consciousness?
And and the neuroscientists had to pay up that he had lost the bet, that they had not solved or even come close to solving the hard problem of consciousness. I mean, the one thing I think you learn when you spend time in scientific communities is how open-ended the debates are and actually how far away they are from really settling things, and also how many rival views there are. Like I said, there's not a scientific image of the human being. There's not a scientific image of like the memory systems in the human being. There's so many conflicting rival research paradigms. There's a lot of open-ended debates that are very much live debates right now. And so I think that there's a certain extent to which, and Wolf talks about this too, that the way in which we kind of have to use social media to market ourselves and even market science has actually led a lot to the corruption of chasing after problematic or too soon chasing certain kinds of inquiry. And actually some of the like real bench work, hard work science doesn't get enough credit, doesn't get enough limelight. And one of the major things that occurred around 2015 was the replication crisis in social and psychological sciences, where sort of benchmark textbook psychological experiments weren't replicating. And the problem was that the way in which the publication process and the way that research focused on not getting negative results or publishing negative results led to a failure to realize that some of what were considered the best psychological experiments were psychological experiments that couldn't be replicated at all. And so it was this, if you're not familiar with this, it's really worth checking out in 2015, this incredible crisis that occurred where they realized many of the major experiments were not replicatable, and they've since tried to replicate them and have failed to replicate them. So there's a way in which when you pursue extrinsic goods rather than the internal goods of the inquiry itself, it can lead to a certain corruption of the inquiry and a failure, the failure to achieve the kind of truths and the serious rigorous science that they were supposed to be pursuing. So now I bring this up also, I have to like point out that if philosophy ever discovered there was some internal crisis, they would never recover from it in the way in which the sciences have. So despite recognizing this in 2015, the measures that have been put in place within 3 or 4 years after that have been incredibly the kind of common good that they recognized they needed to achieve in the sciences, in psychology, and what they've done now overcome a lot of these problems with the replication crisis, the amount of funding that's gone into dealing with that. Now, again, that's now a new kind of marketing of showing that you can undermine famous experiments, and so it leads to this other kind of culture that can be bad in other sorts of ways. But it is incredible. Like philosophy would probably never be able to recognize that it had such a crisis, and if it did, it's not really clear what they would do to make up for it.
Right. Interesting.
So I think that it's important in any of these disciplines for them not to get too imperialistic. And by imperialistic, I mean a discipline that ceases to recognize its own boundaries. And it's perhaps a bit laughable for a philosopher to be talking about other disciplines not getting into too many boundaries, because philosophers are always breaking the boundaries of other disciplines, like spending 3 years in a neuroscience lab. But,
as I said, the queen of the science.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's the case that there's an important distinction that philosophers have drawn between the personal kind of attributes and our subpersonal attributes. So our nervous system our brain constitutes some of our subpersonal attributes. Our cardiovascular system is another one of our subpersonal attributes. And neuroscience really is going to be, I think, the queen of studying those subpersonal attributes. But insofar as it starts...
Can you explain what you mean by subpersonal attributes?
Yeah, so the personal level attributes are the kind of everyday experiences, like you're hearing me, you're listening, you're thinking this is boring, so you're nodding off, or you're thinking this is dead wrong and I can't wait till the Q&A and I'm going to ask a fatal objection. Personal level is the way in which you interact with people every day. It's the standpoint from which you're conscious of hearing these things or having these thoughts. It's what your waking life is like. It's how you interact with your friends and your family. It's how the standpoint from which you would tell a short story or a long story about your own life or the life of your friends and family. So that's what I mean by the personal. Everything that's kind of ordinary that you're used to. The subpersonal are the neurophysiological attributes, the parts of your brain that are going to be indispensable for you actually carrying that out. So if you had some terrible lesions in your medial temporal lobe, it might be very difficult for you to tell the story about your own life, right? You might have terrible forms of amnesia or other kinds of long-term memory loss. So by subpersonal, I mean the parts of the nervous system that are likely dedicated to certain parts of your personal level attributes. And so I think that neuroscience has a lot to say about these subpersonal level attributes. I mean, it is the queen of the sciences when it comes to that. But it becomes imperialistic when it starts to act as if the story that you tell at the level of the medial temporal lobe or the hippocampus is the story of long-term memory.
Right. Because in that case, it's already philosophical. That's how it looks like. Like the approach becomes philosophical at that point.
Yeah, so I think it becomes philosophical at that point. It also starts getting into the territory properly, maybe of psychology. And there's not really necessarily a clear connection between, you can do a lot of correlation work between the personal level and the subpersonal level, but actually explaining what the connection between there is, there's a lot of rival conflicting views about how we explain the connection between the personal and the subpersonal, and those are immediately into philosophical debates.
Right, yeah. And speaking about psychology, the other thing that I wanted to ask you was on psychology, because other than the neuroscience, for sure, one thing that has been hugely influenced, especially in the 20th century, but has certainly changed a lot the image of the human being in a sense, was psychology, the psychoanalytic tradition, the Freudian approach. Um, it was hugely influenced on how we think about ourselves. But for example, the Freudian psychoanalytic approach has put a lot of attention on childhood as the time in which the shape of our sort of like psychological drives are determined. Uh, Conversely, like it seems like philosophy, even if it was the queen of the science, still wasn't able to address much about this. There's not much about like childhood, for example, in traditional moral philosophy or traditional philosophical psychology. So it's certainly a very interesting question today, and I know that you're kind of developing your own account of this. We can call it. Is it right to call it the developmental moral psychology?
Yeah.
So developmental moral psychology is usually grounded on the importance of childhood, for example, right? So I meant to ask you more if you can tell more about your work on this question.
Yeah, so it's a curious thing about the history of philosophy that philosophers seem to be singularly unaware of the fact that they were children at one point in their lives. And so when they give it a story about what a human being is like, and so I work in philosophical anthropology, and if you look at the history of philosophical anthropology, they forget to seem to mention that people ever were children and that being a child was an indispensable feature of what it is to grow up and become an adult, and a rather abled adult. And so if you think about the history of psychological powers,
But by powers, you mean like capacity?
capacities, dispositions. So like the power to exercise reasoning, right? It takes a really long time to teach a child to reason, just to think, to compare things, to evaluate their actions. And they do so begrudgingly. And now that most of us are adolescents into our 20s, they really begrudgingly reason practically well even later and later. So joking aside, like what the approach is thinking about how important it is for philosophers in the Aristotelian and the Thomist traditions, those who follow Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas as I do, that this is a lacuna that we should not persist in ignoring. So even Aristotle and Aquinas have very little to say about this, and most philosophers have very little to say about it. And in the area of thinking about the virtues, the whole point of the virtues is a cultivation of a set of dispositions, a set of ways of perceiving the world, and reactive attitudes, the ways of emotionally responding. So the important thing about the virtues is not just reasoning the right way, like knowing what the right rules are, but it's being able to like size up situations, scenarios, interactions between friends, interactions between strangers, and not just knowing the right thing to do, but like having the right emotional reactions to those in the moment, and knowing how to have the courage or the temperance, the moderation to say the right thing, not say too much, or maybe not say anything at all, to be able to judge situations the right thing. That's what the virtues do. But it's really crucial that we only develop this from like childhood upward, and that there's important ways in which what we expect for flourishing to look like for a child, for an adolescent, for someone that's a young adult, for someone who has a young family, on the way up into someone's senescence. That the concept of flourishing, the concepts of the virtues which go together, they need to be thought of much more developmentally. And too much, even in the Aristotelian tradition, flourishing is something you could really only achieve from like your 30s until your like late 50s. And that's a really misleading human conception of flourishing. And so what it is for a human to flourish needs to be thought of in terms of the narrative arc of a whole life, and how we think about the virtues and the cultivation of the virtues, or the education into the virtues differently at different developmental stages.
Right, right. And can I ask you, like, from your personal experience, this, like, do you see this approach in action, for example, is it useful for, like, for example, I know you have children.
Like with my own children.
Yeah.
Like, am I running experiments on my own children? I haven't published those results yet. So can't speak about that. Well, it's one of those clear cases, if you're sufficiently honest about, do what I say, not what I do kind of thing, right? It's one of those really clear test grounds, though, where you have ideas about the image of what the world you'd like the world to look like, and how you would like to live it, and how challenging it can be to aspire to that. And yeah, in some sense, I suppose that these things are quite abstracted in the way that I think about them, and in the way that they actually get deployed in the everyday. Is there more to that question?
Yeah, like abstraction is nice. I like abstraction. No, I'm struck by this idea. So that virtues, which is a very traditional theme, as you said, Aristotle used to think about virtues and finance and all, like, and it was sort of like the modern kind of mind does not think a lot about virtues, right?
Mhm.
It's a word that we don't even use much in normal conversation. Things like temperance, things like courage. We talk about maybe more like theological virtues, faith, hope, but not much about virtues. But virtues was a category that was sort of like rediscovered, right, in the last 30 years, right, 40 years.
Older than us.
Yeah, older than this. Yeah, true. Like 60 probably.
That's right.
60. And very briefly, if you can like give a bit of context on this, because maybe we didn't explain it. Like, what do you think was the revolution of talking about virtues in the last 50 years? And very briefly, what is the idea there? If you can tell something about this.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. One is that the term morality has come to have a much more narrow sense than what it would have had for thinkers in the classical tradition and the Christian tradition up through the Middle Ages, where the moral would have been anything that you do as a human action. And a human action is whenever you have some sort of responsible control over what you do. So like tying your shoes is something you do with some rational control. It might be a bit routine, but it's something you have rational control over. And it's something simple and small, but it's also something that can contribute in large or small ways to the goods of your life and the lives of others. So for instance, if you were to trip on your shoelace and end up being seriously disabled, the kind of ramifications that would have for you and others in your life would be enormous. But human actions are ways in which we contribute to our good and the good of others in any case. And it's not just rule following that makes up morality. So anything that you do voluntarily with a minimal amount of rational control counts as being moral for someone like Aquinas and Aristotle. Some with greater gravity and some with lesser gravity. What the virtues are dispositions that we have, and vices are other kinds of dispositions. And so in their view, we have them no matter what. Like, you're going to be always cultivating yourself as you react to certain kinds of images of scantily clad human beings in one way, and other people react to them in other ways. And you can make an effort to try to transform the way in which you react to these when you see them as you're filtering through on your phone. Or the ways in which people react to food, or the ways in which people react to conflict. The virtues are a set of harmony or lack of harmony of soul, of your capacities of how you see the world immediately, how you wish you saw the world immediately, how you reason and interact with your friends, It's the role of truthfulness in your interactions, as opposed to just mere rule following. So the virtues are meant to, part of the virtues to exercise virtue is to follow rules, but it's also to recognize the point and purpose of rules.
Right.
That rules are meant to direct you towards goods or keep you away from bads that are bads in every situation. So why is there a prohibition against murder? Because there's never any circumstance under which committing murder can actually contribute to your flourishing and the flourishing of others. So the virtues was meant to rescue. The reason why it came back in is because, one, the sort of obsession with rule following made rule following itself rather arbitrary.
Right.
And the virtues were meant to kind of rescue that again. But also the importance of kind of a vocabulary of the virtues and the vices is actually very practical. It's very ordinary. And so there were a lot of ways in which they've recovered that. And in Great Britain, there's been a lot to actually implement character formation and virtue formation in education. It's been quite successful, actually.
I like a lot the idea of like the importance of like looking at from a practical point of view. And I remember like speaking with you that like people that sort of like propose again this kind of paradigm. I'm thinking about people like McIntyre or Anscombe. Here was a philosopher here in Oxford. Like they were like used to say more like, it's ethics is more about like living a life and not teaching moral philosophy in a class.
That's right. So they always wondered whether or not academic moral philosophy is correcting the academics who are studying it, because it's kind of taking them away from the practical life.
But the other point that I find really interesting is this of where you point out about ends, about purpose, because a lot of like a way in which we think about morality very often is very Kantian. So it's more like, I have this rule to follow, whereas there is no purpose, there is no end. And I remember you suggesting me to read that essay of McIntyre, which says that ends are like so part of our life that it's difficult to imagine a world without ends. And he points out these Quentin Tarantino movies. I don't remember which one. And he says, Quentin Tarantino is so, it seems unreal. It seems almost like not the true reality because there are not ends. So the characters are not like going towards ends. It looks like not real. And I was struck by this because that's like for someone who has watched Tarantino movies, I think that's exactly the vibes that one have. That it looks like not completely real, but it points out that like these how we're being directed towards an end in our life, that we do everything for an end, is so embodied in us that like when you through a piece of art show something completely different, it looks like not real. It looks like so I don't know if you have comments to make about the ends thing.
Yeah, so McIntyre and others have focused on trying to defend an kind of teleology, that the human beings have ends in their lives, and that this has come under a lot of critique because of conceptions of Darwinian evolution, as if, it's shown that animals and humans don't act for ends. And so it's been an attempt to actually rehabilitate the conception of ends and the ends of human life. And the way that McIntyre tries to develop an argument for this is to take a craft or a practice like, say, neuroscience. Neuroscience has intrinsic goods to becoming what a neuroscientist is. And you can't define what it is to become a neuroscientist, or you can't define what it is to become a cattle farmer or a sheep farmer, or what it is to become a dentist, apart from that very practice itself. Like the practice is undefinable apart from its internal goods and its internal ends. And if someone wants to become a dentist or become a neuroscientist, what they discover is that they have to transform themselves to fit the practice. They can't just make up what a dentist is or what a neuroscientist is. And a lot of the history of modernity has been as if the way we know is by kicking off authority, but actually the only way you can become a neuroscientist is submitting yourself to a curriculum. In fact, like 2 decades of a curriculum. So you don't get to pick the books you read. You don't get to pick the experiments you reenact. You don't get to pick how you think through what it is to become a neuroscientist. The authority of your mentors, the authorities of these prestigious institutions you study at, the authorities of the texts, the experiments, they teach you how to transform yourself to become the kind of person that eventually has the competencies to then evaluate. These were the good experiments to run. This was a bad practice in dentistry. We should abandon it and move on to something else, or we should develop a new technology to make this better. And so even though we've made enormous advances in technology and in these technical skills, the role of ends as internal to the very practices we live are indispensable. So we haven't gotten rid of teleology by having developed these new techniques, and we haven't gotten rid of authority either. Authority is actually indispensable for the flourishing of these various practices. And then what McIntyre wants to do is actually say relationships in a complicated way are the same way. The way that parents and children interact, they also have internal ends to them. And if you want to flourish as a family, and it's very difficult, everyone that's in that family needs to recognize those common goods of those ends and learn ways of transforming themselves. And those transformations are simply what the virtues are. So ways of acting justly, or acting moderately, or acting courageously. Parents have to learn that their children need to learn to set their own directionality to their lives as they get older and older. And that parents might want them to do certain things, but maybe those parents don't have good reasons for wanting them to do that. They're living vicariously through their children. And the children should, at certain stages of life, learn to resist those ends. So McIntyre wants to tell a long story about the ways in which we actually haven't given up ends in our lives, both in these practices, within our relationships. And then if you look at the way that people actually articulate their own life story, their lives are either directionless or headed in a direction. If you were to tell a story of your life, it's ended up becoming a story where you can't but help recognize different kinds of failures or different ways in which things didn't quite work out. There was an internal directionality to that life that's discovered as you tell its story. And anyway, this is a much longer kind of argument that one has to give, but it's sort of a small, gradual way of building up to an argument like Aristotle gives for what is the function of a human being and why is flourishing and virtue indispensable to that function.
Thanks. That's really helpful. You were mentioning now authority, right, as category. And at lunch, during lunch, I was telling you that McIntyre is, of course, okay, we were talking a lot about him. Alasdair McIntyre is this Scottish philosopher still alive who lives in the US and was really influential on you, as we can see. And I was telling you at lunch that I'm struck about the fact that this sort of account of McIntyre on authority, on tradition, is really close to what, for example, a guy like Father Giussani, who is important for many of us here, used to think about. Is really close in sensitivity toward the importance of tradition and the way in which rationality, I think, or we can talk about rationality, but we can say our growth as person, like our growth, our personal growth, is always related to a tradition, to an authority, to someone that gives you a work hypothesis through which you have to work through. So, and that's a very interesting point in which I think McIntyre and this kind of Aristotelian tradition and Giussani are really close. But this does not mean that your experience, the experience is not important. So it's not an authoritarianism in the sense that there is no involvement of the personal subject, but there is a sort of interrelation between these two aspects, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you more about this, if these two kind of elements, experience, we started from the fact that philosophy starts from common sense experience and tradition, how these two interrelate, and in your philosophical work, how these two things interrelate.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the reason why tradition is so important for McIntyre's thought is to just going back to this point about what it is to become a neuroscientist. I mean, a lot of thinkers in the modernity think that we've kicked off authority, we've kicked off the authorities of traditions, and that we all just sort of stand on our own. But if you just look at how a science article is published, they'll cite thousands of studies, hundreds of studies, and the knowledge is highly distributed across many different individuals. And the idea that we learn everything on our own is just a complete fabrication. So the role of rationality is always tradition constituted, McIntyre will say, that we learn how to think within a tradition. Everyone's working within one tradition. There are a lot of competing traditions. And you mentioned the point about experience. Well, any childhood upbringing, any adolescent upbringing is going to be, a child's experiences are going to be filtered through the particular tradition that they're brought up in. And so, ours is a culture, whether it's a tradition or not, of a lot of different compartmentalizations of pulling children, adolescents, young adults in lots and lots of different ways. And so the ways in which they get their experiences sort of compartmentalized. And so, they might be taught in certain settings in which lying is always forbidden. But in other kinds of contexts, you're encouraged to lie in very clever kinds of ways or to deceive and manipulate in various ways. And so the ways in which rules within our experiences due to certain kind of traditions can actually have very deleterious effects on human beings as well as constructive ones. And so, I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this particular point about how to connect the idea with experience and tradition.
Okay, can you expand a bit? Because so you think you're saying there is no like univocal way to think about a tradition. So a tradition obviously can be also very detrimental. A
Indeed.
certain way of living a tradition can be detrimental on the.
So we have a very individualistic, atomistic kind of culture. We were talking earlier about neighborhoods and how few people actually are parts of any sort of regular community within their neighborhood. I've lived in numerous places for 5 years on end without knowing a single one of my neighbors, and just as they didn't know any of their neighbors. And so kind of fragmentations of communities into their homes, individuals, and so there's just a culture around that. It would be very weird to go up and knock on your neighbor's door and give them some cookies or biscuits or something along those lines. Things that would have been pretty ordinary growing up, but now are definitely fragmented off. And the point is that the cultural expectations one has in one's experiences are shaped by what other kind of tradition one is brought up in. And so we have then these competing, that's why people have become so tribal today, is because their experiences have been sifted in these tribal tradition kind of ways that are problematic.
Very interesting, yeah. Thanks. About the tradition thing, I have a last question I meant to ask you. It's probably a bit selfish because I work in Thomas Aquinas. I do a PhD on Thomas Aquinas. So I'm really interested in this question, and hopefully can be interested for everyone, I think, since Aquinas has been such an important point of reference in the tradition of philosophical thought, theological thought in the history of the church. But so Aquinas was just the past 7th of March, we celebrated the fact that he died 750 years ago, so quite a lot. And we have just said that the sciences have grown in a very different and chaotic and incredible way also since Aquinas' death. So we were talking about philosophical tradition, and you recognize yourself as someone who is sort of in the Thomistic tradition, so in the tradition of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. Very briefly, what would you say today is really worthwhile to? Why is worthwhile to look at Aquinas as still a point of reference as a guide that can help us to look at the reality of things?
I mean, one thing is, I think Aquinas he's very good at keeping things in the right place and synthesizing them together. So he has this very synthetic view about human nature. He shows the great depths and widths in which philosophy can articulate a lot about human beings, about how human beings relate to ethics and politics, but also how incomplete philosophy is as well. So philosophy is fundamentally incomplete about the biggest questions, about the ultimate ends of life. And so there's a real openness in Aquinas to revelation and theology and what the church has to teach. So there's a real recognition of the role of authority in tradition, but also how that tradition can enrich you and help you go really, really far in philosophical and theological inquiries. It's also the case, and this would take much longer to elaborate, but Aquinas' arguments in defensive views in philosophy and theology are quite resilient. And so when one initiates oneself into that tradition of inquiry that Aquinas has, that the church has not exactly set on a pedestal, but has definitely shown a light and pointed us in that direction to follow that tradition. It is a tradition that enriches one and gives one competencies to respond to some of the best arguments. And so Thomism can make itself vulnerable to some of the strongest criticisms, whether they come from the sciences, come from philosophy, come from the social sciences. And I think Thomism has considerable resources, both from learning from them, but also responding to fundamental objections in substantive ways. So it can make itself vulnerable and stand up and vindicate itself in the face of those objections. So there's a lot more to be said about why one studies Aquinas.
Yeah, no, because at lunch we were telling that the resilience seems to be on the fact that a lot of things that he says look true, simply, yeah. Right? And this is maybe related to what we were telling about the common sense, right? It seems very...
I mean, Chesterton will say how Aquinas is sort of a defender of common sense. And that is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much of an exaggeration. I think it touches the spirit, not the letter of what's going on there, and I think that's right. So Thomas and Aristotle really represent thinkers who take the manifest image seriously and then show how the theoretical image can revise it in various ways and strengthen the common sense image, but without radically being skeptical about the common sense image of humans in the world.
Right. And I like your approach because we started this morning quoting Newman. Beppe puts in his speech this quotation of Newman that says, growing, being perfect is to change a lot, is to change. And I think in your approach, there is this idea that we don't want to get rid of the past, because again, like if Aquinas is a resource for, just because he was born like 800 years ago, does not mean that he has not a lot of true things that are true to say about reality. But still, we want to see these things in the context of today and through the challenges of today. And it seems that doing this kind of work helps both like these different kind of approaches of today to helps us to understand them better, but also to understand like the tradition in which we are, in this case, the Thomistic tradition.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting thing. So traditions can be in dialogue, one tradition to another, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, Pope Leo XIII's kind of slogan about the role of Aquinas for us, which I think is still true 100 years later, 150 years later, is that we have to sort of learn from the old, but on the basis of what we learn from the old, we can perfect it and enlarge it with the new. And so there's always this drawing on that tradition, but then also moving the tradition forward in the new inquiries.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It was really great dialogue. I think there is some 5 minutes for Q&A. If someone wants to, please call me there.
Okay, I think that a lot of us are very interested in practical questions, their parents, workers. Let's take the example of teenagers that are unhappy, depressed, they go to school, they think that their friends are not real friends, whatever. Neuroscience can offer a lot of answers, and I think that the success of neuroscience is down to those practical answers. So much so that it is embedded now in all sorts of counseling. There is an industry, as you were saying, of healthcare based on those results from neuroscience. I understand that you do not discard all those good things from neuroscience, but it seems that moral philosophy can offer something more. But practically, to teenagers, parents, workers, whatever, what is the St. Thomas or Aristotle can practically offer on top of neuroscience?
Yeah, so a great, very difficult question.
I repeat the question just because of the streaming thing. So basically, Tommaso's question was from a moral philosopher perspective. So I guess not just Aquinas and Thomas, but whoever you want. What is the actual like practical benefit that we can bring, especially in education, to children? And I'm not sure about the relation of your question with neuroscience, to be honest. So maybe you can reformulate, Tommy, briefly.
No, meaning.
I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So one is to not just treat them as like theoreticians, but that they're actually giving practical advice about what friendships look like, what relationships look like between parents and children, and that the virtues and vices aren't just this set of theoretical things that you have to take tests on when you're in university and did your moral philosophy class and then you're done with it. But like having a vocabulary of the virtues and the vices and being able to actually have relationships where parents and children are talking to each other and resisting so actually most of the neuroscience goes into learning how to make people really addictive and then learning how to develop software and apps that make people really, really addictive. And that's actually, if there's any brain drain from people doing neuroscience in labs, it's going to Silicon Valley and actually helping develop this tech. So a lot of neuroscience PhDs end up developing the kind of software that makes us as addicted to these things as we and our adolescent children might be. So I think that the real lesson isn't really a brilliant philosophical one, it's one of common sense. What has changed in the way in which parents and families and neighborhoods are organized and structured versus 2 or 3 or 4 generations ago? And how could we as communities, parents, friends of friends, try to claw back and have families and relationships and social lives that are more like that? It's very easy to go home and binge whatever's on Amazon Prime or Disney Plus or something like that. But setting really strong strictures on, days of Sabbath, days of rest, where these are just not allowed at all. We take a box and we put these all there, and we play board games together. We have conversations, or we talk about literature, we talk about our faith, or just have conversations with our children. But there's something about the virtues and vices here that can, I think, help. If you have an actual practical conception of what the vices are, if you know the vocabulary of 8, 10 different vices, you now have a way of thinking about your life of here's a disposition I have or exhibit, and here are the things that I might want to do to actually like pull back and withdraw from that kind of vice, or here's some vicious character of my children, their inability to have friendships or be truthful, their sarcasm and irony is just excessive. How is this hostile or challenging or undermining their friendships and their relationships? So I think in that respect, Aristotle and Aquinas, because they aren't just interested in theoretical debates about the metaphysics of virtues and which psychological powers they're found in, but actual everyday conversations that they can be quite useful if we don't read them in those theoretical ways, but read them in these practical ways.
Question from, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I found it interesting. So my question kind of relates to the relation to ontology.
Can you raise the voice a bit?
Yes, the relation to ontology and consciousness.
Oh, there's a microphone.
So my question relates between the relation of ontology and consciousness. So I'm kind of curious, how do our fundamental principles affect scientific inquiry? Since we are different tribes, we have different fundamental principles. So, for example, I think this argument about objects, something I'm curious about, especially when it comes to consciousness and neuroscience. How you respond to that? How do you thought about it?
Yeah, so if I had an answer to this, I might have a Nobel Prize. So I think that one of the better movements in the last 20 years in cognitive neuroscience has been the embodied movement. So it's sometimes referred to as the 4 E's or the 3 E's of cognition, that cognition is inactive, cognition is embodied, and cognition is embedded. And in many respects, this tradition, some people who write it, like, for instance, Thomas Fuchs, and others actually are overtly Aristotelian. And so they think of themselves as actually engaged in a kind of Aristotelian approach. And it's kind of pushing back against the approach that you were referring to, which is sort of a philosophy of mind approach that owes a lot more to Descartes, whether it be a physicalist version or a dualist version of that. I can't give you a really detailed, long account right here. We could talk about maybe perhaps after this, and I could suggest some things in the direction to read. But I do think one of the great moves of recent years has been this 3 E's approach of these different kinds of inactive embodied approaches to cognition, because they're trying to think more holistically about human beings, and that what we are as persons is composed and dependent on the nervous system. So our psychological powers, our psychological capacities or abilities, memory, consciousness, perception, these are composed out of our neurophysiology, but they're not reducible, or they're not the same thing as our neurophysiology, as our parts of our brains. And so they could take on board Princess Elizabeth's criticisms of Descartes very easily. I mean, they would be making similar kinds of objections and challenges along those lines. So the much longer answer would have to get into hylomorphism, the Aristotelian account of form and matter, and I have some things online that you could easily find that are written to that sort of very difficult metaphysical topic. That's, I think, about as much as I'll say right now.
Roger, the last question.
Yeah, it's interesting how you said that the virtues had a renaissance some decades ago.
If you can take the microphone, people can. Where is the microphone? Disappeared. The microphone.
Okay, it's okay. We can just we can repeat the question.
Yeah, just speak loudly. Yeah.
Might not be on.
Yeah, so you were saying that the virtues had a renaissance a few decades ago, and that's sort of 60s, 70s, roughly.
That's right.
Time scale, and that seemed weird to me in the sense that if I think, for example, of the BBC, before that period, so 20s onwards when it started, the BBC had this kind of clear mandate. Its motto, its thing was to inform, educate, and entertain. So entertain was like third on the list, and it was very explicit. It was explicitly aiming to inculcate virtues. I'm not sure if they use that wording. And then around the period, talking about, everything has stepped away from that, and I guess the feel is kind of who are we to impose our virtues on something. So are the virtues, as in the sort of Thomistic tradition, are they genuinely universal? Can they stand up and be proposed to people as being something that can be, if you like, detached from Christianity and
That's great.
in a neutral way?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So to what extent are the virtues themselves invariant across cultures, or are they invariant to all human beings? One thing about Aristotle is he just gives us a historical test case with limitations for this. So Aristotle himself is already articulating a conception of the virtues in a very aristocratic Athenian culture in the 4th century BC. But it's a view that then gets adopted and developed in various ways, some overlapping, some divergences. More divergences on the margins, but like the cardinal virtues are already in Plato, of justice, of prudence, or practical wisdom, of temperance, of fortitude. And then they get taken up by the Aristotelian Muslims in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, and both in what had been parts of Persia, as well as all the way up into Cordoba, and so the Muslim territories in southern Spain. And then you also have Jewish Aristotelians, like Muslim Maimonides and others, taking up also in the same context, actually in Spain. And then you have the retrieval of Aristotle occurring in the medieval period of the Latin Christendom, occurring in the 13th century. And then you have a number of Renaissance later revivals of Aristotle. And then you have, with the kind of neo-Thomist revival of the light of Pope Leo XIII, you have thinkers like Jacques Maritain, writing as a kind of bourgeois French author in the early 20th century, all the way up into people that are writing on these topics today. So you actually have a pretty good representative, at least in the West, with the Orient being included in part of that as well, of a lot of different cultures finding wisdom in Aristotle's conception and a very readily available conception of the virtues and a way of kind of programmatically thinking about themselves. As McIntyre and others will draw attention to, there are very important differences, though, between some of the fine-grained ways in which Aristotle defines the virtues and, say, Aquinas does. And so, and it's important to recognize the ways in which virtues, there are rival catalogs of virtues. So it's not a panacea in the sense that by the time you get to certain Enlightenment thinkers, pleonexia, the virtue of acquisitiveness, has started to become, it was a vice for Aristotle and Aquinas. It has now become a virtue, and it's still a dominant virtue today of acquisitiveness in property and shareholding and things along these lines. Whereas for Aquinas and Aristotle, it's clearly a kind of vice. So there are going to be disagreements about these. There's also been quite a few studies on the differences between Confucianism and Aristotelianism, and the degree in which there are certain parallels between some of those virtues. So I think there's a lot to be said about how culturally diffuse and invariant some of these virtues are, although there are going to be disagreements on the margins.
Okay, we are running out of time. Unfortunately, there is no space for a question, but let's firstly thank our speakers. No, I was about to conclude. I was just about to say that I think the conversation of today is an example of, for me, of how like philosophy and academic work should be done today, and it's a work that starts from real questions, right? Real question of life. And I saw a quote from John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, that says exactly this, that the inquiry in philosophy, the inquiry of reason, is an inquiry that starts from real life questions, and that's what really matters. So thanks again to our speaker, and I think there are notices that wanted to be said, Maria?
Yes, sorry. Just a couple of thanks again for the meeting. Just a couple of notices. So first of all, if you could kindly leave the room immediately and continue the conversation outside, because we have to set up for the artificial intelligence meeting that is at the piano and things to be prepared. So there will be coffee outside and also in the hall, not here, but in the hall. But then there will be also, so people signed up for 2 exhibition tours of the publication exhibition. Instead, there will be the single one. So whether you sign up for the 3 p.m. or the 3:30 p.m., 3:30 or 4 p.m., it's going to be happening. So there will be one single guided exhibition at 3:45. So, and also for the Takashima guided exhibition at 3:45. And that's it. The next meeting will be 4:30 here, and that's it.